Have you ever finished a book or maybe a film, and you're convinced, absolutely convinced, you understood every single twist and turn?
Oh, yeah.
But then there's this little nagging feeling, right? A tiny whisper in the back of your mind asking, did I really get the whole story?
Mm.
Could the person telling it be, well, a little off? Or maybe you stumble upon, like, a fan theory online that completely shatters your perception.
Right. Suddenly everything looks different.
Exactly. That feeling, that kind of delicious sense of disorientation, that moment you realize you might have been expertly played, that's often the brilliant handiwork of one of the most powerful storytelling devices out there, the unreliable narrator.
It's truly a moment of awakening, isn't it? When you realize the very guide you've trusted through the whole narrative might not be telling you the whole truth or maybe even any truth.
Yeah.
It forces you to completely rethink how you're engaging with the story. You shift from being a passive listener into, well, an active investigator.
Absolutely. And today we are diving deep into that fascinating and, yeah, sometimes frustrating world of unreliable narrators.
It can definitely be frustrating at times.
So our mission in this deep dive is basically to take this stack of articles, some really insightful academic research, our own notes, and just extract the most important nuggets about this incredible storytelling device.
Yeah, boil it down.
We'll unravel its definition, explore its purpose, identify the various types you might encounter, and then we're going to really delve into how it manifests differently across two major literary eras: modernism and postmodernism.
That's a key distinction, the modern versus postmodern approach.
For sure. And we'll also look at how this intricate technique translates from the page to the screen with some truly iconic examples from film.
Mm-hmm.
So by the end of this deep dive, you'll gain a much deeper understanding of why authors and filmmakers use this technique and what it truly reveals about human perception, maybe even your own. So are you ready?
Let's do it. Where do we start? Definition.
Yeah, let's start there. What really is an unreliable narrator?
Okay, so what stands out to me first, and where we really need to begin, is getting that clear definition. At its core, an unreliable narrator is a character whose account of events, for whatever reason, just can't be fully trusted.
Okay.
Their version of reality isn't necessarily the true one, It deviates, sometimes significantly, from what a perceptive reader would consider the objective reality of the story.
So it's not just like a character who's simply mistaken about something small, but someone whose entire credibility is actually in question.
Precisely. Their whole worldview or presentation might be skewed.
I was just reading in our sources that the literary critic Wayne C. Booth was the one who actually coined this term unreliable narrator way back in his seminal 1961 text, The Rhetoric of Fiction.
Right, Booth. A foundational text for this stuff.
Yeah, and he had this really interesting belief that a story doesn't have to perfectly represent reality or truth to be effective. In fact, he argued that a distance from the truth can actually make a text far more exciting and complex.
And I think that holds up, doesn't it? That gap, that uncertainty, is where a lot of the reader's engagement comes from.
Totally. It makes you lean in, pay closer attention. So why do authors use them? What's the purpose?
Well, the primary purpose behind using an unreliable narrator is often strategic. It's to withhold information from you, the reader, or maybe to intentionally steer you in the wrong direction.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very deliberate choice by the author to introduce this element of doubt, this instability into the narrative.
And the effect this has on us, the audience, is huge. It's not just a passive reading experience anymore, right?
Not at all.
It encourages you to actively question the narrative that's being presented, to consider your own interpretation of events, and to really engage in discerning the truth yourself.
Exactly. It almost turns you into a detective, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Sifting through clues, looking for those inconsistencies, those little cracks in the narrator's story.
Yeah, absolutely.
It just makes a story far more intriguing, much more complex, and frankly, enticing compared to traditional narratives with totally reliable narrators. You're kept guessing. You're constantly invested in trying to unravel the true nature of events.
Right.
It adds layers of psychological depth and thematic ambiguity that, straightforward, reliable narration just can't achieve. It pulls you right into the very act of interpretation and storytelling.
Okay. So if we're trying to spot an unreliable narrator in the wild, let's say, what are some of the telltale signs or characteristics we should be looking for? Because, it's not always obvious, is it? Sometimes it's incredibly subtle.
Oh, not at all obvious sometimes. And that's part of the fun, really. There's a whole spectrum of factors that can make a narrator unreliable.
Okay.
For instance, a narrator might be unreliable because of a deteriorating mental state. Maybe they're suffering from mental illness or even psychopathy. Think about how a fractured mind might perceive and present reality. It could distort everything.
That makes sense. Like Patrick Bateman, maybe. We'll get to him later.
Definitely. Or on the complete other end of the spectrum, it could be something as simple as, say, a lack of maturity or even profound naivety.
Oh, right.
Imagine a narrator who's too young to accurately recall events, or who simply perceives the world through a very simplistic, innocent lens. Their picture, while maybe true to their experience, could be very, very skewed from the bigger picture.
Like a child narrator, perhaps.
Exactly. Then there's deliberate deception. A narrator who is actively trying to mislead you, the audience, with a false narrative, just outright lying.
Okay, the manipulator type.
Right. And this is often linked to a strong character bias or some kind of personal agenda. They might have something significant to gain by twisting the facts, or maybe a deep-seated prejudice that just colors everything they say.
And I suppose sometimes it's not even malice, right? It could just be knowledge limitations. They simply don't know the full picture themselves.
That's a great point. Picture a character who's caught in just one small corner of a larger unfolding drama. Their perspective, while genuinely true to their experience, is inherently incomplete. They're unreliable simply because they don't know what they don't know. Memory distortion is another huge factor. Their own memory betrays them, especially over time. As one of our sources notes, what you remember isn't always the same as what you've witnessed.
Yeah, memory is tricky.
It really is.
Yeah.
It highlights how memory itself can become a form of fiction, kind of shaping and reshaping the past, maybe even without conscious intent.
And we can't forget the more immediate factors like being under the influence of drugs or alcohol, which obviously impairs judgment.
That's a clear one.
Or simply a general tendency to exaggerate. Some narrators just can't help but embellish, right? Maybe they just tell a story better than it actually happened, make themselves look better.
Indeed. And these factors often lead to narrators lying to others, but perhaps more profoundly, lying to themselves. That self-deception can be just as compelling, maybe even more so, than any external manipulation.
Wow, yeah.
It creates this internal struggle that's just fascinating to observe. The literary critic William Riggin provided a really useful framework for understanding these different types.
Oh, yeah. What are they?
He outlined 5 common types.
Oh.
There's the picaro, who is a kind of a rogue or adventurer, always looking out for number 1.
Okay.
The madman, which is self-explanatory. The naïf, that simple or innocent character we mentioned.
Right, the child or the ingenue.
Exactly. Then the clown, someone who jokes or acts foolishly, often masking a deeper truth or maybe pain. And finally, the liar, the one who just intentionally misleads.
Yeah, it's helpful. Picaro, madman, naive, clown, liar.
Yeah, these categories provide a valuable lens for analysis and help us sort of categorize the different flavors of untrustworthiness you might encounter.
Okay, so we've got definitions, purpose, characteristics, even some types. Now let's shift gears and really dive into the deeper implications of unreliable narration, specifically how it plays out in that fascinating, sometimes contentious debate between 2 major literary periods, modernism and postmodernism.
Right. This is where it gets really interesting philosophically.
Yeah, the study we're drawing on here, modern and postmodern subject positions, unreliable narrators in The Good Soldier and The Sense of an Ending, sets out to explore exactly that, how the fundamental differences between these 2 movements account for the differing ways their unreliable narrators function.
And what's truly fascinating here is this concept of the subject position, which is really just, a fancy way of saying how an individual sees themselves and their place in the world.
Their identity, basically.
Yeah, their sense of self. And this perception, the study argues, often reflects the broader social and philosophical orders of the time. This study draws on that big philosophical debate between Jürgen Habermas and Jean-François Lyotard to help us understand these shifting ways of seeing oneself.
Okay, let's unpack modernism first then. This literary movement really took hold from, the late 19th to the early 20th century?
Roughly.
It was a period of immense change, right? Shattering old traditions, grappling with entirely new philosophical, economic, social, political ideas. Everything felt like it was in flux. The world was being rapidly reshaped.
Absolutely. And a key tenet of modernism was this kind of obsession with history. Modernist writers were, as the source says, obsessively concerned with history in a double sense, both about what was happening and the very nature of understanding itself.
Interesting. Both the events and how we know them.
Exactly. This created this unresolved tension between art and science, reason and imagination. Modernism simultaneously rejected and invoked the past. It questioned history's scientific factual power, yet it was still seeking some kind of underlying historical truth or meaning.
That's a really interesting point. They were questioning history even as they were deeply engaged with it. This also ties into the period's strong lean towards the scientific method and objectivity, right?
Very much so. The general climate of the modern period was one of rejecting purely subjective opinions and moving more and more towards objectivity. They even tried applying scientific methods to art criticism.
Right.
And this, in turn, led to what are called epistemological questions. Basically, fundamental questions about how we truly know what we know.
Okay.
Questions about identity, society, life itself. It's like science was becoming, as one source puts it, a rival to traditional or authentic religion, pushing for a more objective view of everything, even human experience.
So this quest for objectivity, but also fragmentation, how does that fit?
Well, while modern philosophy certainly embraced fragmentation, a deliberate breaking down of old systems to try and reestablish new ideas, there was still this underlying belief in a core self. The old, solid, and homogeneous notion of self couldn't really account for the needs of modern man anymore.
Right. Too simple.
Yeah, leading to the idea of many personas and selves. But, and this is crucial, despite this fragmented nature, the modern subject was still seen as retaining an essence to their identity, a core self underneath it all.
Okay, there's still something solid there.
Exactly. This is a vital distinction from what we'll see in postmodernism, where that essence often dissolves entirely.
Got it. So, to bring this to life, let's look at a prime example of a modernist, unreliable narrator, John Dowell in Maddox Ford's The Good Soldier.
Ah, Dowell, a classic.
This study portrays Dowell as embodying that certainty of an individual who has a comfortable self-image and knows everything about himself, the people around him, and the world in which he lives.
He thinks he does anyway.
Right. He represents that fixed subject position within modern humanist philosophy, where essential and absolute truths don't change from the beginning of the story to the end. He believes he's got it all figured out, that his view is the correct one.
And what's truly compelling, or maybe disturbing here, is that Dowell's unreliability is far from accidental. It's deliberate and intensely manipulative.
Okay, so he knows he's not telling the straight story.
The source explicitly argues that yes, his resoluteness in his fixed self-image results in his manipulative manner, enabling him to lie directly to you, the reader. He isn't just mistaken or naive, he is actively crafting a narrative designed to shape your perception, to make himself look good.
Oh, he's a master of psychological warfare then. You see it in specific examples, right? Like, he attributes Florence's love of money entirely to her while constantly presenting himself as this selfless victim.
Total self-absolution.
And he portrays himself as this innocent, almost passive observer regarding Florence's affairs with Jimmy and Edward, despite the text giving us clear clues that he's not reliable on this.
Right, those little inconsistencies start to pile up.
He even makes what the study calls omniscient assertions, going beyond the restricted knowledge of a first-person narrator.
How so?
Like, for instance, he comments on Nancy's inner thoughts when he couldn't possibly know them. He says something like, "The girl, at least, regarded him as firmly anchored to his Leonora. She had not the slightest inkling of any infidelities." How would he know that for sure?
Okay. Yeah, that's a classic tell. Claiming knowledge he shouldn't have.
Exactly. This technique empowers him to deceive you, the reader, by seeming to know more than he realistically could.
And the study draws that really chilling analogy between Dowell and the Duke in Robert Browning's poem, My Last Duchess. Remember that one?
Vaguely, yeah. The Duke in the portrait.
Right. In the poem, the Duke is describing this portrait of his late wife, mentioning her indiscriminate smiles. Basically, she smiled at everyone, which he didn't like. And then he says, really ominously, "I gave commands." Then all smiles stopped together.
Oof. Yeah, implying he had her killed.
Exactly. It strongly hints at his direct role in her death.
Yeah.
And similarly, the study points out that a literary scholar, Frank G. Negro, asks if Dowell might have actually killed Florence and Ashburnham.
Whoa, really?
Yeah, it pushes you to question his seemingly innocent facade, just like with the Duke. It makes you reread Dowell's whole story with a much more suspicious eye. Is he just an unreliable narrator or something darker?
So his unreliability is baked right into the way he tells the story. The narrative mode here is what critics call diegetic, right? Meaning he's mainly telling rather than showing.
Yes, exactly. He colors the events, interprets them for you, and directly addresses the reader. Oh, gentle reader, that kind of thing. His presence as an interlocutor is obvious. He's right there, actively shaping your perception.
Which is unlike a mimetic mode, where events are mostly shown and the narrator tries to be invisible, letting the actions speak for themselves. Dowell is definitely not invisible.
Not at all. He's front and center.
And this manipulation, it has a critical effect on you, the reader, doesn't it? While Dowell initially tries to get your sympathy by criticizing everyone else and painting himself as the wronged party,
Yeah, he tries to remove himself from blame.
the study concludes that you gradually lose sympathy with him because of his constant manipulation of the time of the events and never-ending pretense at being a simpleton. He just seems too slippery.
Right. The act wears thin. He is, in the end, less sympathetic than Webster, the postmodern narrator we're about to discuss, precisely because his defeat feels so calculated and self-serving.
Okay, which brings us beautifully to postmodernism, which is framed here as a kind of rejection of many of those modernist ideas.
A pretty strong rejection, yeah. Postmodernism discards things like elitism, the whole high-low art distinction, Enlightenment rationality, and crucially, those meta-narratives.
Meta-narrative, those are the big overarching stories, right? Like religion or the idea of historical progress.
Exactly. Those grand unifying stories that used to legitimize all knowledge. Postmodernism is deeply skeptical of those.
So what does postmodernism emphasize instead?
Well, a central aspect is the concept of a fluid identity. The postmodern subject isn't seen as unified or fixed anymore, but rather fragmented and constructed, decentered, and built on unstable relations of difference. They lack the certainties that the modern subject, like Dowell, clung to.
So no core essence?
Generally, no. This fluidity is often seen positively, actually. One critic, Linda Hutchin, approves of this, saying subjectivity isn't based on eternal values, but on constantly shifting perspectives and contexts.
Okay, so if the self is fluid, then what about history? How does postmodernism view history compared to modernism's obsession?
It's a radical shift. Postmodernism views history as just another master narrative that massively oversimplifies reality. The philosopher Lyotard insists that these grand narratives have declined.
Meaning they've lost their power.
Yeah, they've lost their credibility. History no longer carries the same scientific weight it once claimed. It becomes a matter to be questioned, denied, and criticized, accessible only through the narratives we construct about it.
So history is basically seen as fiction.
Essentially, yes. As one source puts it, a historical text is another form of fiction. It's a story we tell ourselves about the past, shaped by present concerns, rather than an objective, factual record. Hutchin calls works that explore this historiographic metafiction.
Wow, okay. That leads to anti-humanism too, right?
Often, yeah. This philosophy tends to discard the traditional humanist beliefs that reason inevitably leads to freedom, that morality is definite, or that man is inherently rational and autonomous.
So what replaces the autonomous individual?
It often replaces the writing subject, the idea of an author with full conscious control, with language itself, meaning authorial agency is seen as less important. The idea is that the autonomy of the subject is an illusion, and individuals are actually situated and legislated by society and language, rather than being inherently free and self-directed.
And this affects art how? This loss of a stable reality.
Well, because there's this loss or absence of the referent, this questioning of whether there's even a stable real world out there for art to perfectly copy artists gain, theoretically, utmost freedom and fluidity to represent the world as they want, not just as it supposedly naturally is.
Ah, okay. More room for invention, less need to mirror reality.
Exactly. This is a fundamental feature that distinguishes many postmodern artists from modernist writers. It's about breaking free from the constraints of mimetic representation, allowing for more subjective, playful, and constructed realities.
Right. So now let's turn to our postmodern case study. Tony Webster in Julian Barnes is the sense of an ending.
Ah, Tony Webster, a very different kind of narrator from Dowell.
Definitely. He's described as a postmodern fractured character who is split between his younger self and older self, unable to tell fact from fiction. He really reflects that freedom, fluidity, and uncertainty of the postmodern man.
Yeah, he embodies those ontological set of questions about the nature of being and reality itself that really mark the postmodern mindset. He's constantly unsure.
And what's so striking about Webster is how completely different his unreliability is from Dowell's calculated manipulation. It's not deliberate, right?
No, not in the same way at all. He does not try to complicate the story, nor does he jump from one timeline to the other to mislead the reader. He doesn't even use flowery language or try to charm you like Dowell sometimes does.
So where does his unreliability come from?
It stems from something far more universal and, honestly, quite relatable. The inadequacy of memory.
Ah, okay. Back to memory.
Yeah. He constantly questions its credibility. He notes what you end up remembering isn't always the same as what you have witnessed. It echoes that quote from David Shields. Anything possessed by memory is fiction.
That's powerful. And there's that key moment with the letter, isn't there?
Oh, the letter scene is devastating. He genuinely believed for decades that he sent this kind, sort of jolly fine letter to his friend Adrian after his breakup with Veronica.
Right. He remembered it as being quite noble.
Exactly. But then years later, he finally sees the actual letter he sent, and it's just harsh and bitter, full of insulting remarks. Vicious, really.
Ouch.
And this revelation forces him to realize his past self wasn't noble at all, but chippy, jealous, and malign. And worse, he realizes this horrible letter could have had led Adrienne to suicide. It's a moment of just crushing self-recognition.
That's a truly humbling and, yeah, relatable moment for anyone who's ever looked back at their past self with, clearer eyes. And unlike Dowell, Webster seems refreshingly honest about his flaws, right? Very self-scrutinizing.
Incredibly so. He constantly reminds us that his memory may be faulty and admits to omissions not because he's lying deliberately, but due to genuine lapses of memory.
Right.
He reflects on how often we all adjust, embellish, make sly cuts to our own life stories, and how frighteningly, the longer life goes on, the fewer those around to challenge our account. It's a very human form of self-deception he's exploring, not malicious manipulation.
And crucially, unlike Dowell, who blames everyone else, Webster takes responsibility.
Yes, that's a key difference. He does not blame anyone for what happened in the end, and he accepts responsibility for his actions, feeling profound guilt and remorse. He expresses this deep remorse, stating nothing can be done about it. Too much time has passed, too much damage has been done for amends to be made.
Yeah.
But he still tries. He even emails Veronica to apologize 40 years on. It shows a genuine desire to reconcile with his past self and actions, which is totally absent in Dowell.
So the study concludes that Webster is more sympathetic than Dowell because he does not try to manipulate the reader in that calculating way.
Exactly. He presents himself as a fragmented and flawed human subject, and he embraces self-criticism. He's constantly interpreting his own actions, admitting his mistakes, which makes you, the reader, empathize deeply with his struggle for self-understanding. Even his memory is shot.
Okay, so this profound contrast between Dowell, the manipulative modernist, and Webster, the uncertain postmodernist, brings us back to that philosophical debate you mentioned earlier between Habermas and Lyotard.
Right, which kind of underpins these fundamental differences in how they narrate and why they're unreliable.
So Habermas, on one side, he believed that even in our complex modern world, we could, through communication and language, still strive for understanding and some kind of shared sense of truth.
Sort of, yeah. For him, language was a tool for reaching consensus, coordinating actions, and making clear validity claims about the truth of what's said, the rightness of the speech act, and the truthfulness or sincerity of the speaker. He wanted to reconstruct the project of modernity, believing in the possibility of mutual understanding through rational discourse.
Okay, a belief in shared understanding.
Right.
And Lyotard.
Lyotard, conversely, famously defined postmodernism as incredulity towards meta-narratives, that deep skepticism of those grand unifying stories we talked about, whether it's science, history, or religion, that claim to legitimize all knowledge.
Right, no more grand stories.
Exactly. He rejected the idea of universal language games, like science, advocating instead for a plurality of language games. He celebrated divergence and creativity over consensus. For Lyotard, there isn't one objective truth, but rather many subjective interpretations, many different equally valid ways of speaking and seeing.
And this philosophical skepticism is key for postmodernism then, doubting objective truth.
Absolutely. Postmodernists often objected to the very idea of objective truth, universal meaning, and absolute rationality. They linked postmodernism to relativism, fragmentation, decentralization. Some even saw reality itself as a simulation, where signs or representations bear no stable relation to any real reality anymore.
Like Baudrillard.
Exactly. Leading to what some describe as the disappearance of the experience of reality. What they valued most was diversity and difference above homogeneity, plurality over unity.
Okay, so here's the nutshell version, the core insight we want listeners to grasp from this section. Dowell's solid personality and his belief in universal truths align perfectly with that modernist certainty, right? That Habermas-esque search for understanding within a relatively stable world.
Right. He thinks he knows what happened, and he deliberately distorts it for his own ends.
Whereas Webster, With his constant questioning of his identity, his actions, his memory, and his embrace of fluidity and uncertainty, he embodies the postmodern condition. That's Lyotard's skepticism of grand narratives, the embrace of multiple, often conflicting perspectives where even memory is a fragile construction.
Perfectly put. Dowell lies to you, the reader, because he believes he knows the truth and wants to manipulate it. Webster, more tragically perhaps, lies to himself, because for the postmodern self, truth itself is elusive, shifting, maybe even inaccessible.
Wow. That's a truly profound divide, and it fundamentally changes how authors approach unreliability, doesn't it? Okay, now, taking this idea from the page to the screen, that presents a whole new set of challenges and opportunities, right? How do films make us question what we see, not just what we read? It's a different kind of magic trick, playing on our visual trust.
It truly is a different beast.
Yeah.
In film, it's not just the character's words that are potentially suspect. As one source notes, the camera and the act of observing itself inserts itself into the narrative as an agent.
The camera itself is an agent.
Yeah, meaning everything becomes potentially unreliable.
Mm.
The visual information you're given, the editing choices, the music, the very way the story is presented can be manipulated to create doubt, to make you question what you're seeing.
Okay, let's talk about some iconic examples then and the brilliant mechanisms they use. First up, maybe the power of multiple perspectives and contradiction. The Social Network is a great one for this, I think.
Oh, absolutely. Fincher and Sorkin nailed it there. The film is essentially structured like the trial Mark Zuckerberg never got, right?
Yeah.
With you, the audience, cast as the jury, tasked with trying to figure out the truth from these conflicting accounts.
Exactly. We're presented with these competing testimonies about why Eduardo was ejected from the company. Was it Sean Parker's influence? Was it a genuine financial threat? Was it Mark's own jealousy or ruthlessness?
The film brilliantly forces you to constantly ask why, with every new perspective shown in those deposition rooms. And famously, it leaves the truth completely unresolved.
Right. And that ending, with Zuckerberg hitting refresh on Erica Albright's Facebook page, she kind of symbolizes everyone Zuckerberg ever wronged. It just perfectly highlights the subjective nature of the whole film. It leaves you to piece together your own version of reality.
A foundational film in this category, you have to mention Rashomon, Kurosawa's masterpiece.
Oh, of course, the classic.
Yeah, often cited for its groundbreaking use of multiple, completely contradictory perspectives of the same violent event. It forces the audience to confront the idea that maybe a single objective truth doesn't even exist, or at least might be impossible to fully grasp.
And another one mentioned is Roman Polanski's Bitter Moon.
Right, which also plays with this, using flashbacks that seem to contradict each other, constantly making you question the motivations and truthfulness of both halves of this toxic, bickering couple. You never know who to believe.
Okay, so that's multiple perspectives. Then there's the category of deliberate deception and manipulation on screen, where the narrator is actively constructing your reality right before your eyes. The Usual Suspects has to be the prime example here.
Absolutely. The ultimate cinematic con artist narrator. The film visually shows you something within the diegesis, a man being killed, and then verbal Kent's narration convinces you and the detective that this didn't happen or that he wasn't the killer, but just a pawn manipulated by the legendary Kaiser Soze.
Oh, I remember the first time I saw that twist. It's a moment that still makes people gasp, right? Even though some viewers apparently felt irritation about it, maybe thinking it was a cheap trick.
Yeah, you hear that sometimes. But the brilliance, as noted in one analysis, is Kevin Spacey's subtle, small, hidden smirk when his character realizes what the detective interviewing him wants to hear.
Ah, right. He figures out the story the cop needs.
Exactly. And he begins leading him to that conclusion, weaving this elaborate tale based on items right there in the office. It's like that powerful line quoted from another source, The Scar, "Let's help you come up with my plan." It's about the narrator actively constructing the audience's reality, manipulating their understanding of what they just saw.
Chilling. And Fallen is another interesting one mentioned, where the true narrator's identity is hidden.
Yeah, that film is fascinating because, as the source says, the audience, or at least me, doesn't even realize who the real narrator is until the very end. That late reveal is incredibly impactful and sends you scrambling to reevaluate everything you thought you knew about this story.
Okay, moving on to psychological unreliability and memory on screen. Memento has to be discussed here. What a totally new take on the unreliable narrator.
Totally unique. Christopher Nolan, right? The film ingeniously unveils the plot backward, putting you, the viewer, directly into the protagonist Leonard's shoes, experiencing his short-term memory loss right alongside him. You only know what he knows, moment to moment.
But the real genius, the unreliable part, isn't just his condition, is it? It's what he does with it.
Exactly. That's the real twist, isn't it? The realization at the very end is that he has deliberately manipulated himself to be unreliable by using his condition.
He's weaponized his memory loss against himself.
Precisely. He is guilty of the ultimate deception because he creates this parallel narrative, which we've all accepted throughout the film, his hunt for his wife's killer. And then we realize he's been deliberately deceiving himself again and again, choosing targets, choosing facts, even committing the murder we see at the start, purely to sustain his quest for revenge, to give himself purpose.
Wow. And that last line.
Now, where was I? Yeah, it's arguably one of cinema's greatest last lines, perfectly encapsulating his predicament and the terrifying nature of the film's unreliability.
However, not all attempts at this kind of psychological twist land perfectly, right? A Beautiful Mind is cited as an example where the device was maybe less successful for some viewers.
Right. While knowing about John Nash's real-life condition beforehand might mitigate the feeling of being tricked for some, the source notes that many viewers were apparently disappointed when the spy thriller became an overwrought emotional drama.
They felt betrayed.
Yeah, some felt a distinct betrayal from the audience because the big reveal of his hallucinations felt less like a clever twist woven into the narrative and more like a narrative trick designed purely for shock value, pulling the rug out from under the genre they thought they were watching.
Interesting distinction. And what about the science of sleep? That sounds like a more subtle psychological case.
Yeah, Michel Gondry's film. The viewers is subtly warned there to be very careful about believing the real-life scenes, even beyond the obvious fantastical dream sequences. Because the story portrays the main character in the best way possible, from his own perspective. But the latter part of the film indicates that at the very least, not everything is being told, and the story he's presenting might actually be quite contrary to reality. It really challenges your perception of what's real within the film and what's merely his subjective, possibly self-serving interpretation.
Okay, then there's subtle bias and even aesthetic unreliability, where the very look and feel of the film becomes part of the unreliable narrative. That sounds fascinating, like Kubrick's Barry Lyndon.
Exactly, a masterpiece of subtle unreliability. The film's narrator, voiced so perfectly by Michael Hordern, is not lying exactly, but he isn't objective either.
How so?
He injects his own biases and suppositions onto what is happening on screen. He acts more like a slightly stuffy, judgmental historian than a neutral observer, often moralizing about Barry's actions.
That's okay.
The analysis points out that Kubrick's narrator is never thoroughly reliable. His interpretation of his hero's motives are simple-minded, and his moral observations often jarringly intolerant. He panders to the expectations by imputing base motives. It's interesting because the original Thackeray novel had a classic first-person unreliable narrator, Barry himself. The film forgoes this largely, perhaps to avoid being too obvious, opting instead for this more nuanced third-person narrator whose tone and judgment subtly shape our view.
That's really clever. And Rumblefish takes that aesthetic unreliability even further, suggesting the visuals themselves are unreliable.
Yeah, Coppola's film. The source suggests that the film, even the aesthetics themselves, could be a construct of one of the characters, likely Rusty James. The world is extremely romanticized and stylistic. Think of those black and white visuals with bursts of color, the clouds rushing through the sky at breakneck speed.
Right, it looks hyper-real, almost dreamlike.
Exactly. It adheres to our basic reality, but clearly doesn't look like it. This suggests the film's entire world might be presented through a character's subjective, romanticized, possibly unreliable lens. The visual language itself becomes part of the unreliable narration, twisting how you interpret everything you see.
Fascinating. Finally, there's unreliability around the interpretation of reality, even when the events themselves might be factually accurate. A Clockwork Orange fits here.
Definitely. Alex, the protagonist and narrator, arguably tells you the truth about the horrible things he does. He doesn't really hide them. But it's entirely up to you, the viewer, to decide if you agree with his interpretation of those events, his justifications, his worldview.
So the facts might be there, but his moral compass is completely broken.
Exactly. His perspective and moral judgment are so deeply skewed and disturbing that his account, though perhaps factually accurate about what happened, requires intense critical reading from you to truly understand the horror and reject his framing of it.
And of course, we have to mention Fight Club.
Can't talk unreliable film narrators without Fight Club. It's often cited as just a powerful, extremely well-regarded example of the device, famous for its great payoff when the unreliability is finally revealed. It's a masterclass in messing with the audience's perception and trust in what they think they've been seeing.
So, okay, we've covered the classic definitions, the theoretical underpinnings in modernism and postmodernism with Dowell and Webster, and how this all plays out so dynamically in cinema. But it's really important to remember, isn't it, that unreliable narration isn't just some clever gimmick or limited to just these canonical texts or blockbusters.
Absolutely not. It's much more fundamental than that. It's a reflection of people in life, really. It appears in incredibly diverse forms across all sorts of literature, from the most highbrow stuff to surprisingly accessible books.
Yeah, when you look beyond the usual suspects, you find this device everywhere. Consider Nick Carraway in The Great Gatsby.
Ah, Nick. Is he unreliable? People debate that.
Well, the sources argue his unreliability is subtle but incredibly pervasive. He's selective in what he discusses and included. He often seems to overlook Gatsby's more obsessive and frankly unsettling behaviors, like the whole stalking Daisy aspect.
Right, he smooths over the creepy parts.
Yeah, largely due to his undeniable bias for the man. He clearly admires Gatsby.
And F. Scott Fitzgerald actually encourages you to question Nick right from the very start, doesn't he?
He totally does. In the very first paragraph, Nick proclaims he's inclined to reserve all judgments, but then immediately follows up by saying he's only one of a few honest people he has ever known.
Uh-huh. Yeah, quite the claim.
And later, he explicitly says he's on Gatsby's side. It's like a masterstroke from Fitzgerald, immediately signaling Nick's partiality and inviting you, the reader, to doubt his supposedly objective account. It's almost a wink from the author saying, don't trust this guy completely.
Okay, good point. Then there's Patrick Bateman in American Psycho, an extreme example, right?
Yeah.
The madman type.
Oh, completely extreme. The central question for you as the reader becomes, can we trust Bateman's account? Not at all. Bateman doesn't even trust his own account sometimes.
Right, he's not sure what's real himself.
Exactly. But it's the only account we have, so it forces you to navigate this deeply disturbed and potentially delusional mind, leaving you to try and discern what might be truly real within his horrifying narrative, and what's just his warped perception or even fantasy.
And for a groundbreaking twist that kind of redefined a whole genre, you have to mention The Murder of Roger Ackroyd by Agatha Christie.
Ah, the OG twist.
Right, cited as one of the OG unreliable narrator stories. It's famous for that shocking revelation where the narrator's unreliability completely recontextualizes the entire mystery, just pulling the rug out from under the reader in a way that hadn't really been done quite like that before. Genius.
Then there's Kazuo Ishiguro. He seems to specialize in certain kinds of unreliable narrators, like Stevens the Butler and The Remains of the Day.
Yes, Ishiguro is a master of subtle, self-deceiving narrators. Stevens is utterly blinded by loyalty to his former employer, Lord Darlington. He exhibits serious denial about past events, particularly Darlington's Nazi sympathies, and maybe even his own feelings for Miss Kenton, the housekeeper.
So his unreliability isn't malice, it's denial.
Exactly. It stems from deep self-deception, kind of willful blindness, or maybe just a tragically limited worldview shaped by his rigid sense of duty, rather than any active intent to mislead the reader. It's more poignant than sinister.
And here's a surprising but actually brilliant example mentioned, Greg Heffley from Diary of a Wimpy Kid.
Yes, Greg Heffley. It's actually a surprisingly insightful example, especially for younger readers. It teaches them early on about subjective truth and perspective.
How so?
Well, Greg consistently sees himself as the smartest person in every situation, but is obviously just a narcissist trying to better himself, as the source puts it.
Right. He thinks he's the hero, but he's often the problem.
Exactly. His own journal entries, which he writes, inadvertently reveal his own poor social behaviors, his selfishness, his laziness. It illustrates perfectly that his perception of events, and especially of himself, is deeply flawed, despite his absolute conviction that he's always in the right.
It's a fantastic, really subtle way to introduce the concept of subtext and critical reading to young minds. They learn to read between the lines of what Greg says versus what actually seems to be happening.
Absolutely. Then there's another common type we mentioned earlier, the naïf, like the second Mrs. De Winter in Daphne du Maurier's Rebecca.
Right, the unnamed narrator.
Yeah. She is immature or limited through their point of view, constantly feeling overshadowed, insecure, inadequate compared to the memory of the first Mrs. De Winter, the glamorous Rebecca.
So she's unreliable because she just doesn't know things.
Pretty much. She has no idea what is really going on around her, particularly regarding Rebecca's life and death. This leads to a situation where you can't rely on what she says because she doesn't know the full truth. Her unreliability comes simply from lacking complete information or understanding, not from malicious intent. She's lost in a world she doesn't comprehend.
Okay. And for a completely different kind of limitation, what about H.P. Lovecraft's protagonists? Their unreliability is almost cosmic.
Oh, absolutely. Lovecraft is fascinating here. Most of his protagonists have to be unreliable because being human, they literally cannot understand what's really going on in his terrifying universe of cosmic indifference and elder gods.
Their minds just can't grasp it.
Exactly. His brand of cosmic horror often relies on the fundamental inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents, as he famously wrote. Humanity lives on a placid isle of ignorance amidst the dark seas of infinity. So their accounts are inherently fragmented, desperate, incomplete, unreliable, because they're facing the truly incomprehensible.
That's a unique form of unreliability imposed by the universe itself.
It really is. And finally, just one more classic example. Edgar Allan Poe's chilling short story, The Cask of Amontillado.
Montresor.
Montresor himself. He tells us his revenge hinges on 1,000 injuries and an insult he supposedly suffered from Fortunato. But you, the reader, are never told of what these injuries actually are.
Right, it's completely vague.
Totally vague. This crucial absence of information, combined with Fortunato's seemingly trusting nature towards Montresor, even as he's being led to his doom down in the catacombs, makes Montresor's motivation seem wildly disproportionate. It profoundly raises questions about his sanity, or at least the truthfulness of his perceived wrongs. We only have his word for it, and given what he does, that's a terrifying thought.
Wow. Okay, what an incredible journey we've taken. From Booth's initial definition and all those different types of unreliability.
Yeah, the Picaro, the madman, the knife.
Through the really deep philosophical differences between modern and postmodern narrators like Dowell and Webster.
That modernist certainty versus postmodern doubt.
And finally, into all these diverse applications of the device in cinema and other literary works, from Gatsby to Greg Heffley. It's clear that unreliable narration is so much more than just a clever literary trick.
It truly is. It's a powerful tool that makes us, as readers and viewers, question assumptions and actively consider different viewpoints. It forces you, the listener, to become an active participant in constructing the story's reality. It engages your critical thinking skills in a way that goes way beyond just passively following a plot.
Right. It makes you realize that maybe any narrative, even your own memory, might be a subjective construction shaped by biases, blind spots, or maybe even deliberate self-deception.
Exactly. Memory is perhaps the ultimate unreliable narrator we all live with.
Which brings us to our final thought for you to mull over. When you encounter any narrative from now on, whether it's in a book, a film, maybe a news report, or even just a personal anecdote, someone tells you, how will this deep dive maybe change the way you listen and assess the truth that's being presented?
Yeah, will you look for those little cracks now, those inconsistencies?
And perhaps, a bit more provocatively, how much of your own personal history is actually a story you tell yourself? And what might you uncover if you started to look for those subtle cracks of unreliability within it?